Hello and welcome to day 4 of History and Systems of Psychology. I'm so glad you're here. We have a lot to cover today, but I would like to start first with a review. So let's go ahead and talk about our major players that we covered in chapter 1 thus far: Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. I want you to take a moment, and on your piece of paper, I'd like for you to divide it into 3 columns. We'll have a Socrates column, since he came first, Plato, and Aristotle. And what I'd like for you to do in each of those columns is list at minimum 2 things you remember about these individuals. We talked about each one of them for a fair amount of time, but at minimum 2 things you remember. All right, take a couple of minutes to do that. And try not to use your notes. This is just sheer brain power. We have a lot in this class, right? Okay, 30 more seconds. Okay, that was an extended 30 seconds, otherwise known as a minute. Who'd like to start us off? Give us a fact about Socrates.
He didn't believe in writing.
Okay, so didn't write anything down. And do you remember his reasoning behind not writing anything down?
He said that it weakened the knowledge you already had.
Okay. Basically, it weakened your brain power.
Yeah.
Right? Did nothing for your memory. And that writing ideas only partially captured their essence. Great, thank you for starting us off. Others?
About Socrates, correct?
Yeah.
That he believed in pulling knowledge from the psyche. Is that we already had it and we just had to learn, relearn it kinda. It's nothing can be taught.
Right, that's a good way of putting it. So we have this innate knowledge that comes from our psyche. Someone else?
He was the one that did dialogues.
Okay, and can you tell us what you mean by that term dialogue as it concerns Socrates?
Because of him hating writing, he believed in talking. So,
Okay.
like his way of teaching was he wanted to like teach students by asking them questions and seeing like their knowledge that way.
Okay, right, and coming to an understanding of what is right based on what is not right. This was a very active teaching and learning type of quote-unquote classroom, right? Lots of engagement, one-on-one with the sophist teacher of the time, right? And the learner. We're looking for that deep learning to occur. Other things. Have we exhausted everything we remember about Socrates?
He was nativist. He believed in nativism.
Okay. Others. Should we move on to Plato? All right. Well, I will ask you the same question. What information did you write down about Plato?
The allegory of the cave. He wrote that.
Okay, can you tell us a little bit about that? That's very important, and there'll be several questions on the exam about the allegory.
It's like the perception of appearance versus like their ideal appearance. It's like what you physically see versus what's everybody thinks of that object, kind of.
Right, so if we have prisoners that are in the cave, their reality is what they see within that cave. They're blocked from the sunlight. We could think of sunlight in a bigger context as wisdom. So their reality is what they're seeing, but they're missing a huge picture of what's really out there, right? Excellent. Others?
Was he the one that did the academy?
Yeah, someone else, tell me a little bit about this academy.
They had a
Uh-huh.
Socratic approach, but they also did math and astrology and things like that.
Right. So that was had a strong Socratic approach. So lots of dialoguing going with these great minds, right? The great thinkers of the times, but also other subjects were taught. And the idea was not only do we want you to be strong in rhetoric and your public speaking skills so you can become great leaders and educate the hoi polloi, remember that word? The common man. There were also other subjects that were really important in the time. Something else? Yes.
I think, if I remember right, he's the one that wrote Socrates' dialogue in his own way, like he only included what he believed.
Socratic Dialogues. He was the author of Socratic Dialogues, and he recounted Socrates' life, his teachings, his beliefs. It's secondhand knowledge about Socrates. We really don't have any firsthand knowledge because there's no writing, correct? But we also see the Socratic Dialogues as a digestion of the ideas by Plato, right? So that's something always to keep in mind, the lens through which we're viewing history, whose lens we're looking through. Anything else?
Is this in comparison to Aristotle? Was he the one that was pointing up and he was pointing down?
Yes. Moving on to Aristotle. Perhaps someone I haven't heard from. He also started a school. It was not called the Academy, but rather what? Starts with an L. Lyceum, very good. I'm gonna bludgeon the spelling. I have a feeling there aren't that many vowels in one place, but we're just gonna go with it, Lyceum. In some ways similar to the Academy, correct? But even more of a broad focus on an array of disciplines. Good. Other things?
At the Lyceum, I may be remembering this wrong, but there was no like formal classrooms. They did a lot of teaching on foot.
Yeah. So the Lyceum was different than Plato's Academy, where we have people very much in a formal setting, right? These are scholars, they're seated, they're combing through books, they're talking to one another. With the Lyceum, it was actually a grove of trees. That was the classroom. And it was a peripatetic school, which means the walking, right? Good. Other things. Why did Aristotle start the Lyceum in the first place? I mean, this academy thing sounded pretty good, right?
It's passed over to be the academy.
He was passed over to lead the academy. Does someone else remember why this might have been the case?
He wasn't Athenian.
He wasn't Athenian. What else?
He wasn't an aristocrat either.
Yeah, I felt like you were going to say something. He was not an aristocrat. Good. All right. And he did have some differing opinions from Plato, quite honestly. All right. Anything else you remember about Aristotle? Yes.
He tutored Alexander the Great.
Very good. Tutored Alexander the Great. Alex G is what I'll refer to him as. Probably I should not do that. We have not yet touched on a very important idea that Aristotle had that separated him from Plato. Yes. Please get here and then here.
He likened the tissues of organs to a wax table.
Okay, he did that. Going more broadly, he brought us what method?
It was rational.
Okay, we're going to switch and we're going to go to our PowerPoint for Chapter 3 and just fill in some of these holes. That is not to say you didn't do a good job. You really did. And there's stuff there, right? So you already have this knowledge and we're going to fill it in, as it were. Since we are on Aristotle, my thinking is we'll start there and we'll go backwards. All right. As you mentioned, Aristotle was looked over or basically not given the helm of the academy. He was, I want to say he was around, no, I'm not going to give an age because I'm probably really off with that. But he took an odyssey, right? He left for a while and he took the odyssey in northern Greece, including visiting the province where he'd been born. This gave him an opportunity to experience, quote unquote, the real world. So out of the hallowed halls of academia, what was out there? And during this time, he developed a very important method that is central to our understanding and included within the scientific method, which is the idea of empiricism. Is this ringing a bell now? Right? Okay. And Jamie, what you were talking about, the difference between Plato and Aristotle, where we have Plato looking up toward the heavens and Aristotle looking down to the earth, is depicted in this very famous painting called The School of Athens. And as you mentioned, he tutored Alexander the Great. Just to tag on to some of this knowledge, biological taxonomy, do you remember us talking about that briefly? Aristotle, when he was out in the real world exploring, he came to be interested in zoological and biological specimens and began to categorize those, put them in what we call a biological taxonomy. And that's where I gave you the mnemonic device that everyone kind of looked at me, kings play cards on fine green silk. So that was kingdom, phyla, kings play card, class, order, etc. So the various levels. And you had another mnemonic device I wanted you to share with us. Can you share that?
Dear King Philip came over for some good soup.
Okay. King Philip came over for some good soup. That might be easier. Anyway, that's going from largest to smallest organizational framework. For Aristotle, knowledge acquisition included two essential steps: systematic observation. Looking very carefully, actually, I think he said careful systematic observation. So carefully observing, followed by systematic classifications into meaningful groups or categories. Okay. Aristotle likened tissues of sense organs to the surface of a wax tablet. That was mentioned. These sensations imprint upon us. They become part of the things that live in our brains, and then that wax tablet is erased so that new sensations can imprint upon it. A stimulus leaves an imprint that replicates its essential features. Aristotle also believed that we had an innate capacity to organize. As humans, we were organizational creatures from the get-go. Any questions on Aristotle? Nice job getting us started. I just wanted to fill in some of those blanks that we might have. Let's go ahead and back it up to Socrates. A lot of what we talked about is here. You mentioned nativism. That was a big name or a big word at the time, emphasizing inborn qualities as opposed to rationalism, which was reason and acquired skills. The idea of nativism is the idea of an innate mind. As you might recall, Socrates was rather controversial. He was controversial from the way he looked to what he said to what he did. He had a propensity to stir people up. His ideas were not aligned with a lot of other people's ideas in Greece during that time. And the knowledge he was imparting on these young or to these young scholars was often met with skepticism or even fear by older people in society. Started flipping things upside down. All of a sudden, these young scholars are learning how to really think, not just spit back facts. He was arrested at 70 for corrupting these youth and committing treason against Athens, and he died. He was poisoned, and the specific poison was hemlock. Okay. Want to just cover a little bit of Plato, and then we'll talk about Hippocrates and move on. Plato was born, unlike Aristotle, he was born into an aristocratic family. So he had lots of connections, lots of great education from the time he was born. He studied under Socrates, and a lot of what he studied stayed with him and became part of his larger theoretical framework. A key difference was he rejected the notion of nativism. Like we said earlier, he established the academy after he inherited land in his 30s, and the academy was where scholars could come and be with other scholars of much renown, talk about lots of different fields, lots of different ideas were tolerated. And that's not always the case, and it especially was not always the case back in that time. In contrast to nativism, Plato talks about idealism, which is our actual conscious experience of something. This was the example that we discussed in class on Tuesday. We see a particular tree or cat, but lying behind each passing tree or cat, there is something more permanent. You have a dog, the dog's name is Fluffy. You can close your eyes and you can think of Fluffy and all those good times you have with Fluffy, right? But you can also think of Fluffy as being within the group called dogs. You can situate Fluffy within that larger group. Does anyone have a dog named Fluffy? Cat named Fluffy? How about Pumpkin? No, cute name though, right? In short, idealism is the general view that there exists something more fundamental and ultimate lying behind our everyday sensory experience. So we are more than simply these creatures with all kinds of antennae on us that are sopping up that sensory world. We're doing something with that. Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it. All right, tell us, as a class, a little bit about Hippocrates. What do you remember? He's known as the father of what? Medicine. That's a good start.
He had the humoral theory.
Okay. Do you remember what those humors are?
Blood, black bile, yellow bile.
Okay, good. Others?
He steered away from religious views where it was healing and instead looked at more empirical evidence where it was like studying things and figuring out what caused what.
Right. So he was not one to say you have a disease and this is caused by the gods and it's because of something that you did. He looked at the disease and he wanted to research, why did you have this disease? What does it look like and how can I help you? Right? If you think this is something that was delivered from the gods, then there's no reason to help someone. But once you understand that there's a treatment available, there's a diagnosis to be made, then you can help people. He experimented with lots of different herbs and plants, right? And is known, one of his legacies is the Hippocratic Oath, which is do no harm. That oath is still taken by physicians, and a lot of the ethical principles that Hippocrates held dear to his heart are ones that are still in play, hopefully, today. Does everyone feel pretty good about our recap from the past couple of classes? We haven't done anything with the intro, talked about that at all today. If we have some time, we'll do that toward the end of class. All right. Democritus is discussed briefly at the end of our chapter as a footnote. I think it's important to learn a little bit more about him. So that's what we're going to be doing right now. Democritus was a slightly younger contemporary of Socrates. And with a colleague, he came up with this theory called the atomic theory. And this was a really radical theory for this period of time. According to the atomic theory, there's a limit to the divisibility of material objects. So objects can only be broken down so far. They are ultimately composed of tiny, solid, unbreakable particles known as atoms. It's pretty amazing for me to think that this kind of theorizing was going on so long ago. The Greek word atomia means uncuttable. Democritus noted that atoms have different shapes and their movement was random. This word random was not one to be thrown about. The word random contradicted assumptions about the nature of causality, that every caused event has a purpose. And here Democritus is saying, no, Sometimes it's just really random. And that was really hard for people to digest. Having said that, we're going to look a little bit more closely at Democritus. Remember that you are responsible for material discussed in class, for the PowerPoint, and also for any videos that you watch. So my suggestion would be, if you're a note taker, take some notes. If you prefer just to listen and you can remember that way, that's fine as well. You can be more Socratic. Little joke. I got some smiles. I'll take it.
The world is on the brink of war.
They need Captain America.
The pre-Socratic philosopher Democritus was such a prolific writer and influential thinker, he would quickly outshine his teacher, Leucippus. But together, they both stood out as the first philosophers to champion atomism, a materialistic philosophy that says that everything is made of incredibly tiny fundamental particles. While over 300 fragments remain of the writings of Democritus, only 2 remain from Leucippus, and later atomists like the famous Epicurus didn't even believe Leucippus existed. While Leucippus may have been the first to imagine a world of incredibly tiny particles interacting in lawful ways so that, as he says, nothing happens at random, but everything from reason and by necessity, it would be Democritus who really fleshed out atomism, leading to him being the main figure associated with the idea. When early scientists thought that they had found the fundamental particles of the universe and named them atoms, the fame of the early atomists would be ensured for the rest of time. But were the atomists famous or infamous in antiquity? Plato had such a hatred for the atomists that he wanted all the books of Democritus to be burned. Hey, I'm Matt, you're watching Nothing New, and today we're exploring perhaps the most prescient of all the pre-Socratic schools of thought, the atomists, stemming from the simple argument that if it is impossible to infinitely divide matter, then it must be that matter is made up of extremely tiny and indivisible particles. To the atomists, there could only be 2 things in the universe, these uncuttable atoms and the void that they move through. They not only anticipated particle physics and scientific materialism, but also seemed to be some of the earliest atheists. It was said that some people think that we arrived at the idea of gods from the remarkable things that happen in the world. Democritus says that the people of ancient times were frightened by happenings in the heavens, such as thunder, lightning, and thought that they were caused by gods. Today we'll see that even the most modern ideas have ancient precedent. But first, want to see more videos on ancient philosophy? Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. We have new videos coming out every week. Anyways, let's get into it. The confidence of the earliest philosophers is remarkable. Some frame their philosophy as if it were a divine revelation, like Parmenides did. This isn't that crazy, since most of the important knowledge in Greek culture came from the muse-inspired poets. But it makes pre-Socratic philosophy hardly recognizable in terms of what we imagine when we think of philosophy. Most all of the pre-Socratics wrote poems until Empedocles, who was said to be the last to write in verse. Even the dialogues of Plato read like plays, which was a pleasant surprise when I began studying philosophy. The surviving works of Aristotle, in comparison, resembled dense lecture notes. Not because he didn't write flowing dialogues, but because none of them survive. In the writings of Democritus, we do not see flowery and far-reaching maxims, but structured inquiry and investigation. Democritus covered not only familiar pre-Socratic chestnuts such as embryology and why magnets attract iron, but also wrote books on mathematics and geometry, geography, medicine, astronomy and the calendar, Pythagoreanism, acoustics and other scientific topics, the origins of humans and animals, and even literature and prosody. Importantly, it is also clear that not only did he cover this wide range of topics, but he covered them in some depth, for instance by raising and answering possible objections. He was therefore an important bridge between the dogmatism of many of the pre-Socratics and the fully fledged philosophy of Plato. Since some of the basic questions and assumptions were laid out, a dialogue of questioning began in Greek philosophy. At this point, thinkers were mainly building off the thought of others. For instance, Anaxagoras had argued that the natural substances which are the basic building blocks of things were infinitely divisible. However much you divide a piece of wood, it will be wood all the way. But it was presumably Leucippus, as the earliest of the atomists, who made an intuitive leap of genius and proposed that the world was ultimately made up of things which do not have qualities, as wood does. He said that if you were to continue to divide anything, at some point you would reach things which are not further divisible. They are atoma, indivisible. They were responding to Parmenides' criteria of being. That is, that for something to be ultimately real, it has to exist eternally. The atomists proposed that the infinite atoms in the universe were indestructible, and they are in eternal motion through the equally eternal void. According to Democritus, they also varied in size and shape. Everything was explainable by atoms, not gods or divine forces, and the works of the atomists are full of rational explanations for all sorts of natural phenomena. In atomistic philosophy, we generally find a deterministic universe, but thanks to random motion in the atoms, there can also be an allowance for free will. But they didn't believe in a soul, or at least they didn't believe it was anything more than fire atoms, putting forth one of the first philosophies that was strictly materialistic. Death was simply the dissolution of a collection of atoms. Considering the scientific materialistic worldview wasn't popular until the last few hundred years, I think it's safe to say that these guys were incredibly ahead of their time. Democritus also had a lot of insight into how one should live, and he gives us good advice on how to be happy, saying that men achieve tranquility through moderation and pleasure and through the symmetry of life. Want and superfluity are apt to upset them and to cause great perturbations in the soul. The souls that are rent by violent conflicts are neither stable nor tranquil. One should therefore set his mind upon the things that are within his power, and be content with his opportunities, nor let his memory dwell very long on the envied and admired of men, nor idly sit and dream of them. Rather, he should contemplate the lives of those who suffer hardship, and vividly bring to mind their sufferings, so that your own present situation may appear to you important and to be envied, and so that it may no longer be your portion to suffer torture in your soul by your longing for more. For he who admires those who have, and whom other men deem blessed of fortune, and who spends all his time idly dreaming of them, will be forced to be always contriving some new device because of his insatiable desire, until he ends by doing some desperate deed forbidden by the laws. And therefore one ought not to desire other men's blessings, and one ought not to envy those who have more, but rather, comparing his life with that of those who fare worse, and laying to heart their sufferings, deem himself blessed of fortune, and that he lives and fares so much better than they. Holding fast to this saying, you will pass your life in greater tranquility, and will avert not a few of the plagues of life, envy and jealousy and bitterness of mind. When we get into Hellenistic philosophy, we'll see atomism pop up again in the philosophy of Epicurus, who you'll see also knew some of the secrets of living well. But we'll have to save that for later. Now that we've
Still sage advice today.
Compare down versus up.
Mm-hmm. Other things.
I found it a little dense.
There is a lot of information packed in that video. You may want to watch it again. Other things. What was Democritus's view of a soul?
That we didn't have souls, but it was more like fire atoms or things like that.
Again, something that's interesting given he came before Socrates, so pre-Socratic, and then we hear the soul mentioned again, right? And it's not till much later that someone picks back up on a lot of this work. In many ways, I think it maybe society was not ready to hear all those things at the time. He talked about doing things that are in your control and achieving a sense of balance. And that, for me, I made that connection to Hippocrates, live a life in balance. So it's interesting as we look at these different major philosophers of various times, the items that carry over, and then those things that are very specific to the philosopher himself. Okay. Overview of the chapter, some of the greatest legacies of Plato and Aristotle. Plato and Aristotle regarded the human psyche as a reservoir of innate ideas and forms. Aristotle emphasized sensory experience as the necessary raw materials, and together they laid the groundwork for a future science of psychology. We owe them a lot in so many areas of study, but especially psychology. Before the Middle Ages, you hear about a lot of philosophers, a lot of thinking about the human mind, the soul, those sorts of things mentioned, and then the Middle Ages comes into being. I want to talk, this is not particularly discussed within your book, but I think it's important to give you a little bit of context. The centuries immediately following the fall of the Western Roman Empire were called the Middle Ages, and that occurred around the 5th century AD, often referred to as the Dark Ages. Have you heard either of those terms before? When you think, for those of you who've heard of or know a little bit about the Dark Ages, do any images come to mind?
With cloaks. I don't know why.
People with cloaks, all right.
No plumbing.
No plumbing, okay.
Just think of death. Dark.
Think of death and darkness, okay. I'm right there with you.
Yeah.
The writings of people like Democritus and Greek philosophers were condemned as pagan blasphemy. Very serious thing by early Christian scholars. During this period, which lasted around 1,000 years, important scholarship was developed in the Islamic Empire. But we don't talk about that very often at all. During this time, the Islamic Empire was delving into the works that they could find about the Greek philosophers and adding their own spin on things. It's just unfortunate that we don't discuss this more. As the United States, we're very Western focused, and it's very easy for us to forget that there's a whole lot of the world that has great ideas. Okay, have a map to show you. Or maybe not. Okay, I'm going to give it another try. We're going to try a different way. Trial and error, right? First, I will show you this Dark Ages photo. If you look up Dark Ages, you'll see all kinds of depictions. You'll see lots of depictions of Christianity. You'll see a lot of death. You'll see a lot of cloaks. And we could think about that, almost draw this idea of cloaking education, all right? So one of many photos of the Dark Ages, and this is, let's go down one more, a map of the Islamic Empire. And we'll be talking about several of these areas. Arabia, in particular, was an area where there was a lot of scholarship that was being done during the Middle Ages. Non-European scholars came from this area: Arabia, Egypt, Persia, which is now Iran, Mesopotamia, present-day Syria and Iraq, and parts of India. And together, these places constituted the large and powerful Islamic Empire. Islamic Empire rose rapidly a century after Prophet Muhammad's death in 632 AD and led to a time of great scholarship. And not only was great scholarship going on, you have these people who are polymaths, so they're well-versed, very well-versed in an array of subjects. The scholars preserved and translated a large portion of the classic Greek works that were still in existence. Many of those were burned when places of education were destroyed during the fall of the Roman Empire. So the scholars preserved these, they translated them, and they also elaborated on them and added new and revolutionary ideas of their own. So they just didn't say, this is how the world is, these Western philosophers believe this, and now we're going to believe this. It was situated within their social context. Works of Aristotle were a particular focus. As I said, there were polymaths, experts in a wide variety of disciplines. And one that we'll be talking about now is Al-Kindi. Al-Kindi is known for an array of theories, revolutionary ideas. He's also linked to the development and use of Indo-Arabic numbers, the numbers that we use. How many of you are familiar with Roman numerals? Okay. It's always hard for me to write anything more than about 90 or 100 in Roman numerals. It gets tricky, right? And it also gets really big. We'll learn about the development right now of Indo-Arabic numbers and how that represented such a great It was such great progress. We went from those Roman numerals to something that was a lot more easy to understand, and we talk about decimal places, and it revolutionized math.
Welcome to Nada Yada Island.
This season, 4 new bombshells enter the villa.
All right, we are moving on.
5G.
There are robots the size of bees.
Nope. Okay, we're not watching why are scientists making robot insects. I mean, we were watching that. We should not be watching that.
1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I caught a hare alive. 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. I let him go again. These numbers are everywhere in our lives, so much so that I bet you haven't thought much about them. Where did they come from? Where will they go? When did you get here, Cotton-Eyed Joe? Right, okay, so you were probably told that these numbers are called Arabic numerals, as opposed to the Roman numerals you also learned in school, so that you can read old clocks and tell which Super Bowl it is, I guess? Well, what you may not know is that the numerals aren't actually Arabic, or not Arabic originally anyway. To chart the history of these numbers, we'll have to go a little further east, to India. This video is brought to you by my Patreon. So most of y'all probably already know what Patreon is, a platform where audiences can financially support their favorite creators online. Making money online and having a sustainable income from online content creation can be hard, so Patreon allows creators like yours truly to receive direct support from their viewers, like you. I've been making educational videos on YouTube for over 2 years now. You see, I graduated from university in 2020, and as I'm sure you remember, that wasn't a very fun time. So I started making YouTube videos to fill my time and keep me from going crazy. And the growth and positive response to my channel has been really overwhelming. You may have seen me already mention my Patreon in my last few videos, and I already have a lot. So there are 3 tiers on the page: Baron, Earl, and Duke, each with different just watching my videos.
I think we're back.
Our story starts in the 4th century in India, during the Gupta Empire. This was the beginning of the Golden Age of India, a period of history where considerable advancements in mathematics, science, and philosophy occurred on the Indian subcontinent. Things like the decimal system and the concept of zero were invented. But before those things could happen, they needed to invent the Hindu number system. Now, the symbols themselves are older, derived from the Brahmi numerals from the 3rd century BC. We aren't starting with them because while the symbols may be similar, the underlying system is not. You see, the Brahmi script, as well as most numerical systems of the time, like the Chinese and Roman numerals, did not use a place value notation. The Brahmi numerals had separate symbols for 10, 20, 30, and so on. This made doing arithmetic difficult. If you look to these Brahmi numerals, we can already recognize a couple numbers, 6 and 7 being the most prominent. And this morphed into the Hindu numerals. You can see them here on the Gwalior inscription. Some of the numbers look more familiar, while others don't, like our 6 and 7 here. Oh, and here's a dot for 0. So here it is, the number system that gave us our modern numbers. So far the story's been pretty straightforward. Some people in India invented some numbers, and some real ingenious people created an ingenious system. Oh, right, I haven't explained what makes these numbers so special. Well, they use a decimal positional system. What does that mean? Well, think of this. There are a total of 10 symbols in the whole of the Hindu-Arabic set. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 0. With these 10 symbols, we can make any number we want, simply by changing their positions and using 0 as a tens marker. This is 1. At a 0, we have 10, at another, we have 100, and so on. To demonstrate the usefulness of this, here's the number 38 in Arabic numerals, and here it is in Roman numerals. The Arabic numerals only took 2 symbols, while the Roman numbers took 7. Right, so that's all fine and good, but how did these numbers get from here all the way over to here? Well, the clue's in the name. The first citing or mentioning of the Indian number system in the Arab world was before the Arab world was, well, the Arab world. In 662, when the Islamic Empire had just started to stretch beyond the Arabian Peninsula, a Syrian Christian bishop named Severus Sabok wrote about the Hindu numbers and the genius of the Indian mathematicians. Quote, "I will omit all discussion of the science of the Indians, of their subtle discoveries in astronomy, discoveries that are more ingenious than those of the Greeks and the Babylonians, and of their valuable method of calculation, which surpass description. I wish only to say that this computation is done by means of 9 signs. If those who believe, because they speak Greek, that they have arrived at the limits of science, would read the Indian texts, they would be convinced, even if a little late in the day, that there are others who know something of value." This quote is brilliant. Not only does it diss the Hellenistic people for their cultural chauvinism, but it also communicates the awareness and respect some in the Middle East had towards Indian scientists. The Hindu numerals pop up again about 100 or so years later in the writings of Al-Khwarizmi. Unfortunately, we don't have a copy of the book he wrote discussing the numbers. We instead have a Latin translation that was changed when translated. We then have Writings on Indian Arithmetic by Al-Uglaidas and Principles of Hindu Reckoning by Kushyar ibn Laban, both written in the 10th century. These 3 works show that by this time, Islamic mathematicians and astronomers were using the Hindu numerals extensively, though most common Arabs, even literate ones, were not. This makes sense, as for simple monetary or business transactions, one only need basic arithmetic, and most people would do that using their fingers. So, we now have the numerals in the Arab world, but at this point the symbols were starting to disperse into 3 different varieties. In India, they had shifted to the Sanskrit Devanagari, still used today in India. In Arabia, Syria, and Egypt, they turned to what we call the East Arabic numerals, still used in parts of the Middle East. And lastly, the West Arabic numerals, sometimes called the Gubar numerals, evolved in North Africa. It is these Gubar numbers that will lay the foundation for our modern symbols. The Western numerals made their way into Europe through Spain, where the oldest example of their use is in the Codex Vigilanus, written by monks in 9 76. Some in Europe liked the system, like Pope Sylvester II, who tried to spread it around Italy to no avail, as most medieval Europeans used Roman numerals. The great mathematician Fibonacci used them in his groundbreaking Liber Abaci in 1202, and from there the system eventually spread. It was around the 15th century that the numbers finally caught on in Europe. And here's an example from Albert Dürer in 1514 showing the numbers in their current form. So there we are, the history of the Hindu-Arabic numerals, from India to Arabia to Spain to Italy, and eventually the world. If you want to support the channel, please consider donating to my Patreon. And don't forget to like and subscribe.
3 and discuss this video. Jot down the 3 most important points, and then we'll discuss as a group, okay?
On paper or just like in our notes and stuff?
Either way, as long as each group can talk about them, okay? Three.
Let's do 3 here. How about 3 here? And then we'll do, let's see, 3 here and 3 here. Does that work? Did I see the 3 everywhere?
I think so.
Okay.
Mostly.
Try to count Roman numerals.
Yes, like the conversion from Roman numerals to like more simplistic. Yeah.
Those are easier.
Eastern A.
I like the thing
At the beginning, I guess they talked about the 4th century.
They say Gouda, right?
I guess just more west.
Yeah.
We just have one so far.
It looks like a big one,
Well, this
right?
is from earlier.
Oh, okay, okay.
So I'll just write it.
And differences too.
That which is like numbers.
I jotted down.
The starting one, I guess, was the and then it was Arabic.
Yeah, and the Hindu numbers which just came Sanskrit.
Yeah.
Yeah, West Arabic and then to Eastern.
Yeah.
Just like the decimal, like the 40.
Got to like European countries through Spain.
Yeah.
It's like a blast like 30 minutes next year.
It finally caught on in yours.
Just remember if you want to do
Things like the decimal system and concept of
the extra thing I would be
Severus and then because the guy that
the Western.
The hand symbols that they had was the one that
I just remember the
I
picture.
was excited that
Ray and 100 found very similar.
discovering it. Severus Sabuk. And then I know the Pope tried to, but then I think it was Fibonacci that kind of was more successful than the Pope.
I gotta go to the register about this and today's
Is it upstairs?
I don't know anybody, so definitely let me search.
How are you doing? You getting there, or are you there? Made it to your destination?
So.
So-so, all right. Stopped along at Quick Trip to get a bite to eat. Kind Bar and a Diet Coke, that's what I would get. Okay, finish up your Kind Bar, and I would like to hear from you.
I don't know if it's hindsight, but I don't know how, I could see why they were struggling with the Roman numerals.
Numerical system.
Then they had to go and add letters anyway.
30 more seconds, and these are actual 30 seconds.
Talking about the importance of the use and the
Right.
numbers. I mean, yeah, it's in this video. The three that I just wrote is just evolutionary,
But yeah,
like
it just, it's like,
three, and then
why didn't they think of that?
what use has changed to per country, and then combination of like the 15th century Europe onto the number system.
Okay, I want to hear something from each of the 5 groups. Going first might be a good idea, or early on, right? Yes.
The decimal position system,
Okay, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
just kind of made it more simple to like, for bigger, numbers.
Exactly, so you didn't have just this long list of Roman numerals to describe a large number?
Yeah.
Okay, good job. Let's hear from another group. How about the one back here?
We kind of going off of the decimal system.
Okay.
We kind of just said that from the system that the India created, the concept of zero and decimal system derived from that numeral system that they created.
Mm-hmm. Good.
We
All
were
right.
talking about some of the similarities and differences between each system, how like some of the numbers would look the same in different areas, like the 6 and 7 are like 2 and 3s, and then like 4 I never like saw was very different in all of them.
I thought that was fascinating, and just how the system not only looked as it traveled around, but how long it took to travel to the west before it was picked up. I have 2 more groups to hear from, don't I?
We kind of conjoined.
You conjoined? Okay, all right. So you'll have 2 points for us, right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of the same as on everybody else's, but the Arabic numbers, Arabic numerals are just a lot easier to deal with
Mm-hmm.
in general. In English and, well, I guess in writing and in mathematics. So like the Gupta Empire came up with the idea of the decimal system for holding the tens place. It just made it simpler still, which is the idea of holding places instead of just adding
Sure.
everything else to it.
Amazing concept, right? And I don't know how much you philosophize about numbers, but we sort of think of them, at least I do, as always having been here. But the idea that someone did that is really fascinating. Okay, So that was 1 point. One more point for our conjoined group.
We've talked about like the evolution of like the numerical system, how it was
Okay.
like the Brahmi numerals first, and then with like Hindu numerals, and then in the video it said that Gubar numerals were like the foundation for like modern numerals now.
What we basically see, right? Okay. Any other parting thoughts on that video? Moving on, this slide includes your assignment for Tuesday. As mentioned earlier, there were a number of famous philosophers from this era of time in the Islamic Empire. We talk about Socrates, the teachings of Socrates, right? And then we talk about the academy as a place of higher learning. We talk about the Lyceum. Well, in the Islamic world during this period, they had something called the House of Wisdom, aptly put. What I've done here is I've included a link to a fairly brief informational page on the House of Wisdom. Again, would be lovely, like Tuesday, if I could get this link to work. Anyway, I will send it to you via email. That might be the best thing. What I want you to do is read through this link. Jot down, let's have you jot down 3 items, 3 things that you learned. I'm guessing most of you don't know a whole lot about the Islamic Empire nor the House of Wisdom. So 3 things that you learned. Then the gist of the article. Overall, what is your main takeaway from reading this? You are welcome to list more than 3 items. And then finally, a question that you have based on what you read. Maybe it's a point that you think that's really interesting, but it's not elaborated on. To recap, this assignment will be due Tuesday. You will have a workable link, otherwise it makes the assignment really impossible to do. You'll be asked to list a minimum of 3 points, and everyone, I would like these points mentioned within the context of a sentence rather than bullet points. Following that, you'll talk briefly about the gist or your overall sense of the article. What's the main point? If you talk about reading this article and you're telling someone about it, what would you tell them? And then also, what question do you have after reading the article? Any questions on that assignment? Okay, I'll open up a Dropbox. I would love hard copies in class because as we did last Tuesday, I think it's beneficial to share this information, and hopefully by the end of the semester I'll hear from all of you sharing an assignment. We're going to wait on this slide until next week. This is Alhazen. I want to make sure that we cover this philosopher today. And Eric, if I'm not mistaken, you talked about him, right? How I want to pronounce it is Avicenna, all right? That is not how we should pronounce it. Avicenna. Avicenna lived from 980 to 1037. He was born in the Persian city of Bukhara, which is now part of Uzbekistan. mentioned throughout the information that's given about him is this recurring theme that he was not very humble. I don't know why it's mentioned so much. Anyway, this young and not so humble prodigy quickly surpassed his teachers and began studying independently at a very early age. If you want to follow along on page 49, I'm in the second paragraph, starting with "it describes." There was a personal document left behind. It describes him as a prodigy who had memorized the Quran by age 10, who learned arithmetic and algebra from a local greengrocer and was tutored in logic by a professional teacher at age 12. You might think back to what you were doing at age 12. I'll think back. It was not that. Rapidly surpassing his teachers, he continued his studies independently and, focused on translations of the early Greek philosophers, what you would do as a young teenage boy. Sometime in his mid-teens, he undertook the study of medicine, carefully observing doctor-patient interactions wherever possible and quickly developing skills as an independent physician. I'm going to go on to the next paragraph and read this next sentence. Declaring that medicine was much easier to master than mathematics or philosophy, he became famous at age 18 for curing the local sultan of a mysterious illness, and his reward was he had access to the sultan's large library. Pretty impressive stuff. I can understand how maybe he had a reason for not being so humble. He was granted access to the Sultan's enormous library and literally memorized Aristotle's major metaphysical writings. At age 21, he began a long and prolific career. He analyzed Aristotle's writing. You see this a lot with philosophers. They're analyzing someone else's writing, they're building on it, and then they are diverging from it in some way. And so I mentioned on the first day of class, you can sort of see the tree of philosophy or tree of psychology at work. All right, of the works he written, no, it's almost time for class to be out. Of the works that he wrote, 250 of the 500 survive. He wrote the Canon of Medicine. We could liken what he did to who? Maybe to Hippocrates, right? The 5-volume text discussed Hippocrates' humoral theory, with most of the book devoted to detailed empirical observations of many disease states. Sounds like Hippocrates. We're going to describe different diseases, and we're going to elaborate. We're not stopping there. We're going to describe the most effective techniques developed so far to treat them. He didn't end there. It wasn't, we did this and we're done, and here's the volume, and take it with you and practice and heal people. He described over 700 drugs and remedies that he had found to be effective through this empirical approach to medicine. However, he did not believe that this list was fixed and unchangeable. He was very much of the philosophy that medicine should always be advancing, that just because we found this herb to work to treat a certain condition doesn't mean it's the only thing out there, right? We want to continue to search and find the best medicines for treating these different ailments. He also suggested systematic ways to test new remedies. What questions do you have on what we covered today?
Can I say something that I found kind of funny?
I would love that. I think we need that.
The second book that he wrote,
Uh-huh.
I'm reading it from the book. He said it was intended as a cure for ignorance rather than physical diseases. I just thought that was really funny.
Okay, a cure for ignorance rather than physical disease. A bold statement, we would say today. How many friends he had, I don't know. But I think he had respect from people. All right, last thing I would like for you to do is we're going to briefly talk about the introduction, and then if you have a question about what we covered, we are covering huge amounts of information in a short period of time. Well, maybe not huge, but relatively large amounts of information. So if you have a question about what we covered today, I would love for you to submit that via email, or you can write it down and give it to me in class. Let's circle back now to the intro chapter. What are important takeaways that you'll most likely need to be successful on the exam? That's our goal, right? We want to be successful and demonstrate everything that you know and have learned.
The ways to study the history.
The ways to study history. Remember, on the exam, you'll not only be asked to list these different ways, but you may need to give an example. Likewise, it may be that some of these are in the form of a multiple choice question. I give you an example, and then you say what sort of approach that is. Ways to study history. The importance of studying history. More specifically, why it's important to study the history of psychology. One thing I failed to mention, everyone, on our course shell, there should be an Eye on Psychi article. Did you happen to come across that? Or maybe could someone check right now?
Yeah, it should be on there, so I'll do that.
Okay. I'd like for you to read that before class on Tuesday. It's a fairly short article. I think the Eye on Psychi magazine is great for undergraduate students, graduate students, and professors because the ideas are presented in a really palatable way, pretty easy to understand. Make sure you read that. Anything else from the introduction that you would need to focus on? I can't think of anything.
Review the Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Hippocrates.
Right, definitely review them. So review everything from chapter 1. One suggestion is start studying for the exam now. Take a look at the questions. So at the end of each chapter, there are a list of essay questions. My plan is to draw on those questions for the exam. If you go to page 56, you'll see discussion questions and topics. It might be a good idea to ponder some of those so you have an idea of what the essay question is going to look like. And then also the key terms are good. And as you're testing your knowledge, a nice thing to do would be to get out a piece of paper or your computer and go through those key terms, and without a textbook or notes, try to define them yourself and see what is coming easily to you and what is a little bit more difficult. And then I like to star those items and make sure I spend some time brushing up on that. Those items are also ones you may bring to class because maybe the explanation you had on them wasn't quite thorough enough for you to really get the gist of what it's about. Excellent work. We're 1/8 of the way done with the semester. I don't know how I feel about that. Making swift progress. I hope everyone has a great day. Remember the assignment due on Tuesday. Contact me with any questions you have, and have a good rest of your week.